get starting. My talk is all about language and how accents and language shape and form our identity. And those of you with perhaps an ear for an accent may have already formed an impression of my identity just from what I've been saying so far. I may even fool some of you into believing that I'm more sophisticated than I really am. But it was George Orwell that said in the 1930s that all Englishmen are branded on the tongue from birth, that you could tell so much about someone from the moment they opened their mouth in particular, not just the region of England from which they came, but also the social class they aspired to. My parents both come from working class backgrounds at opposite ends of England. My father from the suburbs in civil service of London, and my mother from a northern mining town. And growing up, neither of my parents would have sounded like me at all. In fact, my accent owes nothing to their geography or to their class. Now, all this talk of class, it was a century ago that George Bernard Shaw wrote that no Englishman can open his mouth without another despising him. And it's still remarkably true today, 100 years on, that so much is judged in England by the way you speak. Assumptions about pretension and status are all formed based on your language. And I was born in the town of Macclesfield, which is at the perfect center point of my parents' origins. In the 2004 Times newspaper survey in England, it was listed as the most culturally deprived town in England. But it's a town with a rich cultural history that dates back as far as the 1086 Domesday Survey of the land during the time of William the Conqueror. And at that time, the 11th century, it fell within the borders of the Hundred of Hammerston, which sounds a little Game of Thrones, but it's just the Old English word meaning a division of land that houses 100 homesteads. And the reason I mention this is because it's sort of the perfect pronunciation test for aspiration, the aspirate. In England, so much depends on it, the H sound. Those who drop their H's are considered unforgivably crude and working class. And growing up in Macclesfield, I adopted its regional accent, so to me it was the 100 homesteads of Amiston, and there's a particularly snobby class of people who would sort of turn their nose up at that in England. And that touches on a long history of anxiety over the letter H in England. There's so much concern over it that, in fact, H has now become a legal variant of the letter form in British English. And one theory for this is just that school children who are being repeatedly told not to drop their H's have hypercorrected and added them where they really just don't exist at all. And in the early 19th century, the words hotel, hospital, and herb were all actually pronounced without the H in Britain. It's interesting and how that's changed. America has actually clung on to its H-less herb, and that's perhaps because it has less class anxiety associated with its language. But let's not stop at H. This talk is also brought to you by the letter R. When I introduce myself to Canadians, sometimes they have a hard time picking out my name. I've had Mac and Mock and even Mog. And that's because my very ordinary name, Mark, sits on a sort of an important pronunciation divide in our languages, the letter R, what they call rhoticism. And some mistakenly believe that Canadian English has actually diverged from the original British English, but in fact the reverse is true, that British English was once rhotic. And it was only after the American War of Independence that Brits began to drop their R's. That's a sort of a joke, it's an arse or an ass here. And one of the main reasons for this is because during that time, the 19th century, the upper classes were reacting against the new rich, who brought with them a great deal of, they were powering the Industrial Revolution, they brought a great deal of social, they brought a lot of wealth with them, but particularly not social honor. So the upper class began to codify their language in order to separate themselves, distinguish themselves. Now, Canadians have held on to their R's, but they haven't adopted the British phenomenon of the U and the non-U, the non-upper-class words on the left and the upper-class variants of them on the right. And this comes from a 1950s essay published by the linguist Alan Ross that set out these differences in cultural vocabulary and social vocabulary. It's, the middle classes on the left, represented by Kate, and Will on the right, the upper-class version. And this sort of touched on a big anxiety in that time in the middle classes who were eager to climb in their social standings. So the echoes of this impact are still reverberating in British English today. Now, language is continually evolving, and each generation speaks differently to the one before. The younger and older generations are continually jostling and jousting over pronunciation divides like H and H, and whether it's dessert or pudding. But English adapts. It's a very fluid language. Not all are as lucky to evolve and adapt as quickly. Some are at the whims of sort of history and the circumstances of their politics. My family left England when I was 8 years old, and we moved to Luxembourg, a country 1/3 the size of the GTA that's nestled here between France, Germany, and Belgium. Well, it's still nestled there. I went to a European school, which is sort of a Tower of Babel of languages. There were 11 languages taught in my school. And my English accent and my vocabulary are very shaped by that experience and that environment. And some English people actually argue that I don't really have an accent. I speak a sort of an international English, but that's really not true. Everybody has an accent, except perhaps the mute. There are 7,000 languages in the world today, and some say there may only be 1,000 by the end of this century. Some languages, I spoke Luxembourgish growing up. Luxembourg is very proud and protective of its language. I spoke it with my village friends. I lived in a village, and sorry, I lost my place. I wanted to say here that Luxembourgish is now on the endangered UNESCO language list. And when a language dies, it's incredibly sad. It's like the death of a species. Wir willen blijven wat we zijn in Luxembourgish means we wish to remain who we are. And I think language is incredibly important. And I just wanted to end on a quote from Clemenceau, who said that he was a patriot but not a nationalist. And people asked him to get the French Prime Minister to clarify. And he said, I think a patriot loves this country, but a nationalist hates others. I feel like we should all be very patriotic of our own language, but respectful of the identities and influence of others. Thank you.